Hi guys, welcome to chapter 4. We get to talk all about genetics and heredity in this chapter. Last chapter we talked about DNA and genes. Now we're going to talk about how they actually pass this information on to offspring. So we're going to cover section A today and talk a lot about this concept of heredity. Okay, heredity is actually a study of something, and it's the study of genetics. Okay, so it's the study of how traits are passed from parent to offspring. Genetics deals with that field of traits being passed from parents down to offspring. Excuse me. Okay, the traits are the characteristics that we actually see in the organisms, and they can usually happen in two or more forms. The stuff that we're going to talk about in this section is only two forms, but it can get more complicated than that. Okay. The alleles are the different versions of that same trait. So when you think of eye color, there's several different eye colors. There's blue, there's brown, there's green, there's hazel. Those would be the different alleles, the different versions of the gene for that trait. Again, all the stuff we're going to talk about in this chapter, we're only going to be talking about two versions, so two alleles, okay? A dominant trait is one that shows up if that allele is present, and it's always represented with a capital letter, okay? Let me get my pen. So if I'm talking about I don't know, height, okay? If something is tall or short, I'm going to use a letter that represents that. And I can use H for height, but I'm actually going to use the T for tall, okay? The capital T would be used then to show that dominant allele, that dominant trait. And if that shows up, that's what's seen in the organism, okay? And then there's a recessive trait. That would be the less frequently seen trait, and we would show that with a lowercase letter, okay? In order for the recessive trait to show up, both alleles or all alleles have to be that recessive allele, okay? That's why it's seen less frequently. All you need is one of the dominant alleles, and that dominant trait shows up. But for recessive, all of the alleles have to be recessive for it to show up, okay? And you can see in this little chart up here, this idea that these parents are carriers of a certain trait, okay? Let me move myself, there we go. Without getting into too much detail of that chart right there, the fact that this person is affected tells me that that is a recessive trait, that they had to get it from both parents. And it doesn't matter what it is, it doesn't matter, don't worry about those letters. The AB does not represent the alleles here, but you see it on both of the chromosomes, okay? When it's only on one of them, they're considered a carrier, but they don't actually have the traits, okay? The parents both had to be carriers in order to pass that down to the offspring. If you have two of something, that means you got it from both parents, because you get one gene from each parent for every single trait we have, okay? And we'll talk a lot more about that. All right, so there's this dude named Gregor Mendel, and this is back in the 1860s, and he's a monk, and he likes to garden, and he's working with pea plants, like little pea pods. And he's doing all kinds of experimenting with them. And he's looking at the color of the pea pods, he's looking at the height of the pea plants, and he really discovers a lot, so much that he becomes known as the father of genetics. He really comes up with this idea of these traits being passed on to the offspring. Now, he dealt with what's known as simple dominance, which are characteristics that are controlled by one gene, but only two different alleles, okay? So only two versions. So everything we talk about in this chapter is going to follow this simple dominance, just because it's kind of the intro version of genetics. We won't be talking about eye color. It's even too complicated. Blood type, there's more than two. Hair color, things like that. So everything we talk about is only going to have two versions. A couple more vocab words along with that. A hybrid or a homozygous organism is one that has one dominant allele and one recessive allele, okay? So if we're talking about the letters again, they would have one big T and one little t. Excuse me. And then a purebred has two of the same, and it can be both dominant or both recessive. The fancy scientific term for that is heterozygous, okay? So purebred would be both dominant or both recessive, okay? So what he did is he took some pea plants that he knew were purebreds, okay? So he knew that these were both dominant T's and these are lowercase t's. Now the book's going to talk about the pea pod color itself, and I'll talk about that in class. I'm going to talk to you guys about the height of the plants. So he took tall plants that he knew were purebred because they only ever had tall offspring. He had short plants that he knew was purebred because they only ever gave short offspring. And he thought that there'd be like this medium plant that was built, or at least a mix of plants, as the offspring. And what he saw was every single offspring was tall, okay? So he crossed these again. He took a couple of these first generation plants. This P generation is the parents. That F1 is the first generation, familial one, okay? And they were all tall. He was like, wow, what's happening? What does that mean? So he crossed them again, and then he got this combination here. 75% of the plants were tall, and about a fourth of the plants, to 25% of the plants were short, okay? We're gonna go over this again once we cover a little more information, and we're gonna get to the letters. We're gonna get more specific with this. So we're gonna come back to that picture in a minute. All right, first we need to know how to do Punnett squares though. A Punnett square puts parents on the outside and the offspring in the middle, okay? So you take the alleles of the parents and you kind of split them up. So this would be two hybrid plants. They'd both be tall because they've got a single dominant allele there. And you split it up a little bit because the parent can only contribute one allele, okay? And then you treat this kind of like a multiplication table, a times table, okay? So this big T goes in there and this big T goes in there, and so you wind up with this. Then this big T goes down there, and then that little t, and so you wind up with this. Little t, big T, okay? Another hybrid. Little t, purebred, okay? Now remember what I said about dominant recessive. If the capital letter is there, if the dominant allele is there, it will show that dominant trait. So all three of these are going to be tall, okay? So we would say 3 out of 4 are tall, which matches that screen that we just looked at, and we'll come back to that. 1 in 4 is short, okay? So you gotta keep in mind that this is only showing the probability of the offspring. This is not the actual offspring. We're not always just getting 4 plants as offspring. What it means is if this plant had 100 offspring, we could assume that about 75% of them would be tall and 25% of them would be short, okay? So you can use either a fraction or a percentage to talk about the probability that's shown from these, okay? The genotype is the actual combination of letters. So these letters inside of this Punnett square right here, those are known as the genotype. The phenotype is the actual physical trait. So whether they are tall or short, that's called the phenotype. And I always remember that because phenotype starts with pH, and physical appearance also starts with pH. The genotype is more about the actual alleles on the genes, okay? All right, so let's do a couple practice runs here. We've got a couple of purebred parents over here. They're both homozygous. The capital letters mean that they're purebred dominant. The lowercase means that they are purebred recessive or homozygous recessive. Doesn't matter what the trait is, okay? So we're going to do this like our little times table. We're going to match these up. And we see that every single one of the offspring is a hybrid, okay? Every single one of the offspring will show that dominant trait because they have one dominant allele. That recessive A, that lowercase a, is masked by that dominant allele, okay? This is what happened with the tall and the short pea plant with Mendel's first cross. Remember, all of the offspring were tall. That's what's happening, okay? Now let's do a different one. we've got a purebred dominant, and now we've got a hybrid, okay? Both would be showing the dominant trait, whatever that is, because there's capital letters there, okay? But let's see how these will cross. So we get two capitals, and then two recessive, okay? So 100% of this crossing would also show the dominant trait, okay? This is why the dominant is dominant. It shows up so much more. You would have to have both parents having the recessive allele in order for that trait to show. So let me erase this real quick, and let's imagine, get back to the pen here. I'm going to use a different color. I'm going to use red. Okay. So let's imagine this is a lowercase a now. So I've got two hybrids. So I've got big A, big A, big A, little a, big A, little a, and then little a, little a. This is that cross that I showed you the first time with the pea plants, okay? These three, so 3 out of 4, or 75% of the offspring in this case, will be dominant, but we finally get some recessive offspring because both parents carry that recessive allele. 25% or 1/4 of the offspring could be expected to show that recessive trait, okay? All right, like I said, back to the plants there, okay? So the parent generation, the first plants that he crossed were purebreds. So we've got big T, little t, okay? Just like I showed you, if I cross those purebred parents like this, all of my offspring are going to be hybrids, because the tall plants can only contribute the capital T, and the short plants can only contribute the lowercase t. So all of the offspring will have that hybrid mix, okay? Their genotype would be hybrid. Their phenotype, they will all be tall, 100% tall, okay? But now if we cross those, that's like the last one I just did. If I do a big T, little t, big T, little t, there's my Punnett square. Big T, big T, big T, little t, big T, little t, little t, little t, okay? So 3 tall. One of them would be purebred. 2 of them, 50% of them would be hybrids. And then just 1 of the 4, 25%, would be this recessive lowercase t's, okay? This shows that same mixing. It's just 2 hybrids, but now this is with the pea colors, the pea pod colors that he was dealing with. Yellow would be the dominant trait. Green would be the recessive trait. If you had 2 hybrid parents, they'd both look yellow, but they'd both have this recessive allele to contribute. So 25% of their offspring would have that recessive trait. Whew, told you there'd be a lot. All right, soak it all in. That's all I've got. See you guys.